6 months after the incident that shook the airline industry, a different kind of gathering took place in the same airport where it all began. The large conference room was packed with airline executives, media representatives, and aviation professionals from around the world. The atmosphere buzzed with anticipation as people took their seats for what would become a landmark moment in aviation history. The young billionaire CEO stood at the podium, dressed in his signature casual style, this time a dark blue hoodie that had become something of a symbol. Behind him, a screen displayed the results of the first wave of the new training program. Employee satisfaction up by 40%, customer complaints down by 35%, and most importantly, incidents of bias-related conflicts reduced by an incredible 87%. But the real story wasn't in the numbers. It was in the person walking onto the stage, the flight attendant whose moment of prejudice had sparked this transformation. She looked different now, carrying herself with a quiet confidence that came from months of deep personal work. The room fell silent as she approached the microphone. 6 months ago, I made a terrible mistake, she began, her voice steady despite the emotion visible on her face. I let stress, prejudice, and unconscious bias control my actions. I judged someone based on their appearance, and I acted in a way that shamed not only myself but my profession. She paused, taking a deep breath. But through this journey, I've learned that our worst moments don't have to define us, they can transform us. She went on to describe her role in developing the training program, how sharing her experience had helped shape scenarios that would prevent others from making similar mistakes. The counseling sessions had helped her understand the deep-rooted biases she hadn't even known she carried. This program doesn't just teach us what not to do, she explained. It helps us understand why we do what we do and how to be better. The young CEO stepped forward again, sharing how the program had expanded beyond its original scope. 15 major airlines had already adopted it, with dozens more in talks to implement it. The scholarship program had awarded its first round of grants to minority students pursuing careers in aviation, with several of them sitting in the audience that day. But the real success, he said, gesturing to the screen behind him, isn't in these numbers. It's in the stories we're hearing every day. The screen filled with testimonials from airline staff worldwide, sharing how the training had changed their perspective and improved their interactions with passengers. A surprise announcement came next. The flight attendant had been promoted to lead the program's implementation across multiple airlines. Her experience and transformation made her the perfect ambassador for change. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The very incident that could have ended her career had instead given her a platform to make a real difference. The young CEO shared his own reflection too. When I started my tech company, I wanted to change the world through innovation. But this experience taught me that real change often starts with simple human interactions. Sometimes the most powerful technology is our capacity for understanding and forgiveness. As the presentation concluded, something unexpected happened. Staff members from various airlines in the audience stood up, sharing their own stories of bias they had faced or unconsciously perpetrated. The conference room transformed into a space of honest dialogue and shared commitment to change. The day ended with the launch of a new industry-wide initiative, Aviation for All. Its mission went beyond just preventing discrimination. It aimed to make air travel a space where everyone truly felt welcome, regardless of how they looked or what they wore. The story that had started with a slap had evolved into a movement, proving that sometimes the worst moments can lead to the most meaningful changes. The airline's corporate headquarters buzzed with frantic activity in the days following the incident. Emergency meetings filled every conference room, PR teams worked around the clock, and lawyers hurried through hallways with stacks of documents. The company's stock had dropped 12% since the videos went viral, and angry customers were canceling reservations by the thousands. The flight attendant sat alone in her small apartment, watching her 15-year career crumble around her. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from colleagues, but she couldn't bring herself to read them. News vans parked outside her building made it impossible for her to leave without being bombarded by reporters. Her immediate suspension felt like the least of her worries as social media continued to explode with opinions about her actions. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner office overlooking the city, the young billionaire CEO was taking an unexpected approach. His legal team had prepared a massive lawsuit, but he pushed it aside. Instead, he pulled up the proposal he'd written on the flight. A comprehensive plan that would transform this crisis into an opportunity for industry-wide change. "We're not going to sue," he announced to his stunned executives. "We're going to solve the real problem." His team exchanged confused looks as he pulled up a presentation on the large screen. It outlined a revolutionary training program that would address unconscious bias, cultural sensitivity, and customer service excellence. But what made it unique was its approach, using advanced AI technology to create realistic simulation scenarios that would help employees understand and overcome their prejudices. The airline's CEO received the proposal with visible relief. Instead of a lawsuit that could bankrupt the company, here was a chance to become an industry leader in addressing systemic bias. The young tech leader offered to fund the entire program through his foundation, with one condition: it would be made available to every airline, not just the one involved in the incident. But the most surprising part of his proposal came next. He wanted the flight attendant involved in the incident to be part of developing the program. "She made a mistake," he explained to the bewildered airline executives. "But her experience, if she's willing to share it, could help prevent countless others from making the same one." The flight attendant received this news through her union representative. She read the email 3 times, tears streaming down her face. The message included a personal note from the CEO: "We all have biases. The real measure of character is what we do once we recognize them." Along with the invitation to join the program development team, there was an offer for counseling and support services. As news of this unexpected turn of events spread, media coverage shifted from outrage to intrigue. Instead of another story about public shaming and career destruction, this was becoming something different, a story about transformation and second chances. Social media buzzed with discussions about forgiveness, accountability, and the possibility of real change. The airline industry watched closely as the training program took shape. It wasn't just about avoiding bad publicity anymore. It was about fundamentally changing how airlines approached customer service and human interaction. Other companies started reaching out, wanting to be part of what was becoming a movement rather than just a response to a crisis. The Young CEO's Foundation set up a scholarship program alongside the training initiative, focusing on increasing diversity in aviation careers. "This isn't just about preventing negative interactions," he explained in a press conference. "It's about creating positive ones. It's about building a future where everyone feels welcome and respected in every space they enter." What could have been a story of public humiliation and career destruction was transforming into something more meaningful. The incident that had sparked millions of angry social media posts was now inspiring conversations about compassion, growth, and the power of choosing understanding over vengeance. As the plane touched down in New York, it was clear this wasn't going to be a normal deplaning process. Through the windows, passengers could see a crowd gathering near their gate: airline executives in dark suits, media representatives with cameras, and security personnel creating a protective barrier. The evening sun cast long shadows across the tarmac, setting a dramatic scene for what was about to unfold. Word had spread quickly during the 3-hour flight. The videos had gone viral before they even reached cruising altitude. #FirstClass Assault was trending nationwide, with millions of views and shares. But what nobody except a few tech insiders had realized yet was exactly who had been slapped. The young man in the hoodie sat quietly as the plane taxied to the gate, reviewing documents on his tablet. The red mark on his cheek had faded, but the impact of what had happened was about to send shockwaves through the airline industry and beyond. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from his executive team, board members, and media outlets, but he focused on finishing the proposal he'd been drafting throughout the flight. As the seatbelt sign dinged off, the captain's voice came over the intercom, requesting all passengers to remain seated. The businessman who had spilled his drink earlier leaned across the aisle, his eyes wide with recognition. "You're him, aren't you?" he whispered. "The AI guy. The one who's revolutionizing healthcare with artificial intelligence." The young billionaire smiled softly and nodded. Around him, other passengers started pulling up news articles and photos on their phones, their faces showing dawning recognition. The quiet man in the hoodie wasn't just any tech executive. He was the founder and CEO of one of the world's most innovative companies, valued at over $50 billion. His company's AI technology was already saving lives in hospitals across the globe. Their breakthrough algorithms were helping doctors diagnose diseases earlier, making healthcare more accessible to underserved communities, and revolutionizing medical research. Just last month, Time magazine had featured him on their cover as the future of medicine. The flight attendant who had committed the assault was sitting in the back of the plane, her face pale as airline officials explained the situation to her. The realization of whom she had slapped seemed to physically weigh her down. Her hands trembled as she looked at her phone, seeing her action playing out on every social media platform, accompanied by headlines revealing her victim's identity. As airline executives boarded the plane, their faces grave with concern, the young CEO stood up. Despite being the victim, he carried himself with dignity and purpose. "Before we proceed," he addressed the officials, "I want to make something clear. This incident isn't about me or my position. It's about a bigger problem that needs addressing." Reporters outside were already piecing together the story, how a flight attendant's unconscious bias had led her to assault one of the world's most influential tech leaders, a man who had started his company in a garage and built it into a global force for good. The irony was stark. The very person she had judged by his casual appearance was someone who could have bought the entire airline without blinking. But what the media didn't know yet, what no one except the young billionaire and his closest advisors understood, was that this incident was about to become a turning point in corporate America's approach to bias training and employee education. As he stepped off the plane into a sea of flashing cameras, he was already envisioning how this moment of conflict could be transformed into an opportunity for lasting change. Time seemed to slow down in the first-class cabin as the unthinkable happened. The flight attendant, pushed beyond her breaking point by her own prejudices and stress, did something that would change multiple lives forever. Her hand moved through the air, and before anyone could react, she slapped the young billionaire across his face. The sound echoed through the cabin like a thunderclap. For a moment, everything stopped. The murmur of conversations, the rustle of magazines, even the sound of luggage being stowed in overhead bins. The only noise was the distant hum of the plane's engines, a stark backdrop to the shocking scene that had just unfolded. The young man's glasses were knocked slightly askew, but his calm demeanor never wavered. He slowly reached up and straightened them, his movements deliberate and controlled. The red mark blooming on his cheek stood in stark contrast to his composed expression. Years of meditation and self-discipline showed in his response, or rather, his lack of one. Around them, the cabin erupted into chaos. A child in the next row started crying, startled by the sudden violence. An off-duty pilot jumped up from his seat, moving quickly toward the scene. Several passengers were already on their feet, their voices raised in protest. "That's assault," someone shouted from the back. "She can't do that," called another voice. Phones were everywhere now, recording from every angle. The soft blue glow of dozens of screens lit up the cabin as passengers captured what would soon become one of the most viral videos of the year. Some were already typing furiously, no doubt sharing the incident on social media even before the plane had left the ground. The flight attendant stood frozen, her hands still raised, as the reality of what she'd just done crashed over her like a wave. The anger drained from her face, replaced by a dawning horror. Her whole body began to tremble as she realized that in one moment of unchecked rage, she had not only crossed a professional line, but had committed a criminal act. The young billionaire calmly reached for his phone. No anger, no shouting, no threats, just smooth, deliberate movements as he dialed a number he knew by heart. "Yes, this is the CEO," he said quietly into the phone. "We have a situation that needs immediate attention at Gate 23. His voice was steady, carrying the weight of someone used to handling crisis situations. Other flight attendants finally reached the scene, their faces pale with shock. One gently led her colleague away, while another began apologizing profusely to the young man. But he wasn't listening. Instead, he was watching the flight attendant as she was led away, noting the way her shoulders shook with silent sobs. In that moment, despite everything, he was already thinking about how this incident could be turned into an opportunity for positive change. The businessman who had spilled his drink earlier stepped forward, insisting on being a witness. "I saw everything," he stated firmly. She blamed him for my accident and then he trailed off, shaking his head in disbelief. An elderly couple across the aisle were nodding vigorously, already writing down their contact information to provide statements. As airline officials began boarding the plane, summoned by the CEO's phone call, the young billionaire remained in his seat, his laptop open, typing quickly. Those close enough could see he wasn't writing an angry email or a lawsuit brief. Instead, he was drafting a proposal for a comprehensive training program, one that would address the root causes of what had just happened. The incident had lasted less than 5 minutes, but its implications would ripple out far beyond that first-class cabin. In an age where viral videos often led to quick judgments and cancel culture, this story was about to take an unexpected turn, one that would challenge people's expectations about power, privilege, and the possibility of redemption. The tension in the first-class cabin grew thicker as the young billionaire raised his hand politely, hoping to get a glass of water before takeoff. It was a simple request, one made by passengers hundreds of times each day. But today, it would trigger a chain of events that nobody aboard could have predicted. The flight attendant approached his seat, her heels clicking sharply against the cabin floor. Her expression hardened as she noticed it was the hoodie-wearing passenger making the request. "Your boarding pass," she demanded, despite having checked it twice already during boarding. The words came out clipped and harsh, drawing curious glances from nearby passengers. The young man reached for his pocket with practiced patience, having grown used to such treatment despite his success. He'd experienced similar situations before, at high-end restaurants, exclusive hotels, even at his own company's buildings when wearing casual clothes. As he handed over his boarding pass for the third time, a hint of sadness crossed his face, not for himself, but for how quick people were to judge others based on appearances. "I just need some water, please," he said softly, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had nothing to prove. But his polite tone seemed to irritate the flight attendant even more. She snatched the boarding pass, scrutinizing it as if determined to find something wrong. Just then, a businessman 2 rows ahead accidentally knocked over his pre-flight champagne while reaching for his briefcase. The sound of glass clinking against the floor drew everyone's attention. Without missing a beat, the flight attendant spun around and, to everyone's shock, immediately blamed the young man in the hoodie. "Sir, you're causing disruptions in the cabin," she announced loudly, ignoring the businessman's attempts to take responsibility. The false accusation hung in the air like static before a storm. Other passengers shifted uncomfortably in their seats, some pulling out their phones, sensing that something unprecedented was unfolding. An elderly woman across the aisle spoke up, but he didn't do anything. The flight attendant cut her off with a sharp gesture. The cabin grew quieter, the kind of silence that falls before something significant happens. The only sounds were the distant rumble of engines and the muffled conversations of boarding passengers in economy class. The young billionaire remained seated, his hands folded calmly in his lap. He built his tech empire on the principle of staying cool under pressure, and this moment was no different. "Ma'am," he began, his voice steady and respectful, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. Could we speak with your supervisor?" His reasonable request seemed to push the flight attendant further over the edge. Her face flushed red as she leaned closer, pointing her finger accusingly. "Are you threatening my job?" she demanded, her voice trembling with barely contained emotion. The question was so far from his actual words that several passengers exchanged worried glances. The businessman who had spilled his drink stood up, his face red with embarrassment. "This is ridiculous," he started to say. "I'm the one, whoa." But his words were drowned out by the flight attendant's increasingly aggressive tone as she continued to berate the young man in the hoodie. The other flight attendants noticed the commotion and began moving toward the scene, but they were too far away to prevent what happened next. The young billionaire remained perfectly still, his expression a mixture of concern and compassion, even as the situation spiraled out of control. He understood that this moment was bigger than just him. It was about patterns of behavior that needed to change. Phones were recording now, their small red lights blinking like silent witnesses to the unfolding drama. Nobody knew it yet, but these videos would soon be seen by millions, sparking conversations in homes and offices across the country about prejudice, privilege and the power of responding to hate with dignity. The lead flight attendant's day had started badly and was getting worse by the minute. Her alarm hadn't gone off, her car had a flat tire, and now she was dealing with what seemed like the most demanding group of passengers she'd encountered in her 15 years of flying. Her usually neat uniform was slightly wrinkled from rushing, and wisps of hair escaped from her once perfect bun. She'd already handled 3 separate complaints about the flight delay, comforted a crying baby, and dealt with a passenger who insisted on bringing an oversized carry-on into the cabin. The morning's chaos had left her nerves frayed, and her typically warm smile had become forced and tight. Her colleagues noticed her unusual tension but kept their distance, recognizing the signs of a veteran flight attendant reaching her breaking point. As she moved through first class during the pre-flight check, her eyes landed on the young man in the black hoodie. Something about his casual appearance in the premium cabin irritated her already stressed mind. In her exhausted state, years of unconscious biases bubbled to the surface, clouding her usually professional judgment. She found herself wondering how someone dressed so casually had ended up in first class. The flight's delay had put everyone behind schedule, and the pressure from management to maintain on-time performance wasn't helping. She could feel her supervisor's eyes on her as she worked, adding another layer of stress to her already overwhelming day. The coffee machine in first class was acting up too, which meant more complaints would surely follow. Her steps became more hurried, her movements less graceful than usual as she tried to complete all the pre-flight tasks. Other passengers seemed to sense her agitation, some shrinking back in their seats as she passed. A businessman asking about the Wi-Fi password received a curt response, very unlike her normal helpful demeanor. Through the cabin windows, dark clouds were gathering, promising turbulence ahead, a perfect mirror of her internal state. The weather report showed storms along their route, which meant service would be more challenging than usual. She caught her reflection in one of the cabin mirrors and barely recognized the tense, frustrated person staring back at her. The other flight attendants whispered among themselves, sharing concerned glances. They'd never seen their colleague this way before. She'd always been the one they looked up to, the one who handled difficult situations with grace and professionalism. But today was different. Today, all her years of training and experience were being tested by a perfect storm of stress, fatigue, and unconscious prejudices. As she prepared for the final safety check, she overheard snippets of conversation about flight delays and connecting flights. Each complaint, each demanding tone, each entitled gesture from passengers seemed to chip away at her remaining patience. Her hands trembled slightly as she checked the overhead bins, a physical manifestation of her mounting stress. The cabin pressure felt different today, heavier, more oppressive. Or maybe it was just the weight of her own mounting tension. She found herself taking deeper breaths, trying to maintain composure, but the simple breathing exercises that usually helped weren't working. The morning's frustrations had built up like layers of static electricity just waiting for the right moment to discharge. Little did she know that her next interaction would not only change the course of her career, but would also spark a national conversation about prejudice, professionalism, and the power of redemption. As she approached the young man in the hoodie again, the cabin's atmosphere grew thick with unspoken tension, setting the stage for a confrontation that would soon go viral and force everyone involved to face uncomfortable truths about themselves and society at large. The morning sun cast long shadows across San Francisco International Airport's Terminal 3 as a young man in his mid-30s walked quietly through the first-class lounge. Despite being worth billions, he carried himself with the humility of someone who remembered harder times. His simple black hoodie and worn jeans reflected his down-to-earth nature, a stark contrast to the tailored suits surrounding him. As the owner of a revolutionary AI company, he had transformed the tech world with innovations that made people's lives easier. But today, he wasn't thinking about his next big project or the upcoming acquisition meeting in New York. His mind wandered to the small noodle shop where his parents had worked endless hours to put him through college. The memory of their sacrifices kept him grounded even as his net worth crossed the $8.5 billion mark. The first-class cabin welcomed him with its usual luxury, but he preferred the window seat where he could watch the ground crew work. It reminded him of his first job as a teenager, loading luggage at this very airport. He settled into seat 2A, pulling out his laptop to review some documents before takeoff. A couple across the aisle whispered and stared, probably wondering why someone dressed so casually was in first class. Other passengers filtered in, some giving him curious glances, others completely absorbed in their own worlds. A businessman in an expensive suit almost tripped over his own briefcase while doing a double take at the hoodie-wearing passenger in first class. The young billionaire just smiled softly, used to these reactions. He never felt the need to prove himself to anyone. His phone buzzed with messages about the upcoming meeting, but he took a moment to text his mother instead. "About to take off, Mom. I'll bring you those special tea leaves you like from New York." Family always came first, no matter how big his empire grew. The response came quickly. "Stay safe, son. Don't forget your scarf. It's cold in New York." As the cabin crew began their pre-flight preparations, he noticed how some of them worked with practiced efficiency while others seemed stressed by the morning rush. Through the window, he could see the fog rolling in from the bay. A signature San Francisco scene that still amazed him even after all these years. He pulled out a worn paperback from his backpack, a habit he'd maintained since his college days riding the bus. Reading helped him stay centered, especially before important meetings. Today's choice was a book about space exploration, another passion he hoped to pursue through his company someday. The cabin started filling up with more passengers, each bringing their own story aboard. A grandmother helping her grandchild find their seat, a young couple clearly embarking on their honeymoon, and several business people who looked like they'd already had their third coffee of the day. He observed them all quietly, remembering how he used to dream about flying first class while working at the airport years ago. The familiar announcements began overhead, but something felt different about this flight. Maybe it was the unusual tension among the crew, or perhaps it was just his intuition warning him that this wouldn't be an ordinary journey. He tucked his laptop away, keeping only his book out as the final preparations for takeoff began. Little did he know that this routine flight would soon turn into a situation that would spark conversations across the country and challenge people's preconceptions about success, appearance, and human dignity. The events about to unfold would not only change his life, but would also become a catalyst for much-needed changes in the airline industry.